We'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody. My name is Cole Simcoe, and with that, I would like to get things started and hand things over to Christy Scott.
Yes, good morning. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. I'm Christy Scott, the Project Director for YP2LE Learning and Evaluation. Thank you for joining us for this very important discussion this morning. I will not take too much of our time as we want to really use our hour to discuss this important topic. So I'll hand it over to Nancy also for a quick introduction, and then we'll move forward.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. Great to be with you. I'm Nancy Taggart. I'm the COR for YP2LE Learning and Evaluation, and I'm also a youth and employment specialist. And like Christy, I'm really glad to welcome you and eager to hear your input on our discussion today. I think back to several years ago when we had those sessions in person where we were really hammering out what were those priority learning questions. And so I'm really interested to hear what we've learned so far. I've seen the slides, so I already know a little bit, but I'm excited to hear from you all what we're missing. And I know we'll continue to gather more resources and data toward this updated learning agenda, but I'm really happy to be a part of this and to be supporting it. So looking forward to our discussions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Christy and Nancy, for your introduction to the event. And we can move on to the next slide. So for today's event, our key objectives are really to describe to you our key recent research learnings related to YP2LE's PYD Learning Agenda based on initial findings from a literature scan activity, and to gather input from you all as our key stakeholders on our literature scan findings as we inform our updates to our learning agenda and our evidence pages on our YP2LE platform. These are web pages and resources that serve as a place for our learning network members to learn key information on our 5 learning agenda themes that we're going to be discussing further today, and to link to external resources on each of our thematic topics. Next slide. So for today, we're going to start with a brief overview of our activity from our Senior Monitoring and Evaluation Learning Advisor of USAID, Rebecca Pagel, after which my colleague and I, Shrika Bhattacharya, Technical Advisor of Research Evaluation and Learning at Making Sense, and I are going to be describing our activity methods and findings from our literature scan activity, after which our Advisor of Innovation and Learning, Stephanie Schmidt, is going to facilitate a question and answer session and conclude our event. Next slide. And now I'll hand it over to Rebecca Pagel to talk more about the activity that we're going to be discussing today.
Thanks so much, Chelsea, and everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to have you all here. So a strong evidence base for positive youth development programs is crucial for both improved programming and increased advocacy for that programming. And the PYD Learning Agenda is a key way that we organize our collective strengthening of this evidence base. But as we know, as Nancy mentioned earlier, that the learning agenda is a few years old now, and we and others have done a lot of work in that time to advance the evidence that is the focus of this learning agenda. So in this activity, the purpose of which is to review and synthesize the evidence that we have and update the learning agenda, really comes at a critical moment. So we are, today we'll be looking at evidence that the team has reviewed around the 5 themes of the learning agenda. Understanding how PYD programs achieve positive impacts in low and middle income countries, cross-sectoral impact of PYD programs, measurement of PYD constructs, which you can see in the graphic in the visual to the right of the screen, PYD for vulnerable and marginalized populations, and youth engagement in PYD programs. As you'll hear in a moment from Chelsea, this webinar today is really key to our effort to understand the state of the evidence and to update the learning agenda. So I'll hand it over to Chelsea now.
Thank you, Rebecca. So as a note, just throughout our presentation, please feel free to note any questions you do have in the chat, and we can get to them during the Q&A portion of the event. But to talk a little bit more about our activity methods, the goal of the literature scan activity that we're going to be describing findings from today was really to capture recent research-specific learnings related to the 5 PYD Learning Agenda themes that Rebecca just reviewed. This was not a systematic literature review activity, but rather a focused review that included identification of research-oriented YP2LE and external resources from the years of 2017 onward that target specifically youth in low and middle income countries. These are the criteria that guided the identification, review, and decision-making on inclusion of our key resources in the review process. Examples and resources that we identified and included were technical reports, briefs, case studies, peer-reviewed articles related to quantitative and qualitative research and evaluation studies. And in addition to the reviewed YP2LE resources, the external resources that we identified were identified via online searches, outreach to our YP2LE Learning Network via our Youth Power and Youth Lead platforms, our YP2LE newsletter, as well as targeted outreach to members of our YP2LE Learning Agenda Advisory Group, who provide technical insight on existing gaps, emerging learnings, and key priorities for YP2LE research activities to advance the PYD Learning Agenda. After our resources have been confirmed for review, we've been synthesizing any of the key information, including relevant PYD themes addressed in the resources, the geographic region or regions of focus, as well as sectors of focus, youth age segmentation of focus from the research studies, key takeaways, study outcomes and gaps, and recommendations for future research and programming. So today we're at this highlighted red block, sort of in terms of our activities and steps for this activity, where we want to share our literature scan findings with you all before continuing our review. Next slide. So today we're going to be sharing with you an overview again of our preliminary findings from the resources that we've reviewed and identified thus far. But we also want to offer you all the opportunity to weigh in on additional topics, resources, and key learnings for inclusion in our ongoing review and PYD Learning Agenda page updates. So just to note some of our key high-level findings, many of the research documents that we identified align with the PYD approach, but they don't always explicitly reference PYD. However, a notable number employ a social ecological model approach, which addresses the enabling environment of the domain of PYD. Many studies are also still applying a binary approach to measurement of gender identity, which is particularly important as we think about including youth who are from vulnerable and marginalized backgrounds and addressing their intersectional needs. Both YP2LE and external resources addressed all of our 5 learning agenda themes to some extent, but 2 themes that seem to be less commonly addressed, particularly were youth engagement and cross-sectoral impacts. Although we did find a number of studies that highlighted our theme of PYD impacts for vulnerable and marginalized youth. Among the resources that we have identified thus far, they were primarily related to work that was completed in Africa, or they were not specific to a region, meaning they were global in nature, didn't have a region-specific focus. Resources that we did identify tended to include primary data collection or systematic literature reviews, at least for the more rigorous activities. And we note this finding because it relates to a trend we observed when we were identifying resources for inclusion in our review. More specifically, we found resources with varying degrees of rigor in their application of different research methods. Some studies included activities with mixed methods research, with multiple primary data collection points, and systematic literature reviews often followed specific frameworks such as Cochrane, but other resources that we identified seem to be lacking this level of rigor, or they did not use validated metrics or scales, for example, when carrying out quantitative research in particular. We did consider the rigor of resources when we were identifying and reviewing resources for inclusion and excluded those that were lacking. Dominant sectors of focus that we saw in our research studies that we did identify were primarily health, as well as a lot of work related to gender and gender equality, especially studies that focused on mental health and sexual and reproductive health topics and related outcomes among youth. Youth engagement, to note, while its own learning agenda theme, often overlapped with other topics that we identified in our reviewed resources and related themes, such as youth participatory approaches to data collection, which was highlighted in resources that were also related to PYD measurement, for example, and PYD for vulnerable and marginalized youth. I will also note that although our search did not specifically seek out resources related to youth programming in the context of COVID-19, This is a topic that did come up more in recently developed resources in the past year or so. So although those that were research oriented were limited, we do want to highlight some of these findings just due to the relevance and timeliness of these particular research resources. Next slide. And I'll hand it over to my colleague, Sharika Bhattacharya.
Thanks, Chelsea. Hi, everyone. So I'll be sharing some highlights related to our review of resources identified under this learning agenda theme of understanding how PYD programs achieve positive impact in low and middle income countries. So there has been increasing acknowledgement of the need for systems level approaches to youth development. Around the world, young people are typically interacting with and moving through multiple systems, health related, education, social, that operate within their own spheres with limited coordination between them. And this can lead to gaps in service delivery and missed opportunities for young people. Through the resources we reviewed, we identified some ways in which different systems might come together through PYD programming around positively impacting youth outcomes and LMICs. So starting with schools, schools offer a basic foundational setting for promoting health and well-being. Programming opportunities go beyond those that are focused on academic achievement or educational attainment. There are examples of health interventions being implemented through schools, including for comprehensive, more systemic approaches, but uptake and sustainability of these efforts is limited. There is a potential for health and education systems to work together more closely in supporting young people through schools as a delivery method. And the link between these systems is particularly relevant in the context of COVID-19. Whole school approaches that incorporate health and PYD can positively affect social and emotional well-being, improve soft skills and learning outcomes, and reduce health risk behaviors. Plus, schools provide safe spaces for girls and young women in LMICs. But education professionals and health professionals and policymakers may not always see schools from the same perspective as a neutral platform to deliver health-related interventions. Implementing targeted, discrete health programming in schools is not the same type of undertaking as a more comprehensive approach that is meant to affect school policies and practice and engage the wider community. One example of a whole school approach is health promoting schools developed by World Health Organization, which has been shown to improve student health in both low income and high income settings. Wanted to quickly talk about another sector now. Another example is the integration of agricultural education in schools, particularly relevant given the ag sector for economies within Africa, for the large proportion of youth engaged in farming activities, or rural youth who live in areas with high ag potential. Youth-centered ag policies and investments are key given the rising number of young people and the need for economic opportunities and livelihoods that do not put too much strain on natural resources. Essentially, school-based ag education initiatives can help involve youth as early adopters of ag innovations by integrating aspects of PYD. So thinking specifically about the contribution domain, youth can be empowered to be change agents for implementing ag innovations in their larger communities. Related to the point about the social ecological framework, so considering how individuals, their relationships, the larger community and societal factors interact to influence youth outcomes. PYD programming that is more holistic, engaging the larger community, influencers in young people's lives, including a focus on the enabling environment. These have been found to be more promising as far as influencing youth outcomes. Another brief example I wanted to share is Our Family, Our Future. This is a resilience-oriented intervention which seeks to engage families in prevention of adolescent HIV and depression. And the accessibility, feasibility, and preliminary efficacy of this intervention was tested in a sample of adolescents in South Africa with mild depressive symptoms. There were high levels of family satisfaction with the program among participants, and all families were retained in post-intervention assessments. Participants reported diminished depressive symptoms and increases in HIV testing 3 months out. So this is an example of a promising intervention that needs more study with a larger sample size that extends the period of follow-up and that uses multiple forms of data collection, so not just relying on self-report. So these were just some brief highlights from resources reviewed. I wanted to move on now to talking a little bit about our next theme, cross-sectoral impact of PYD programs. So under this learning agenda theme, I first wanted to set the stage for talking about cross-sectoral impacts by highlighting 6 cross-sectoral youth assessments that were conducted under YP2LE. These were published in 2020. Although these were carried out in multiple countries in Africa and in the Eastern and South Caribbean, there were similarities in what young people need to thrive in their communities, which cross-sectoral PYD programs can ideally help address. Specifically, access to quality and relevant education that prepare youth for the labor market was an overarching need. And this is sometimes compounded by limited formal job opportunities and high levels of unemployment. Sexual reproductive health and family planning knowledge, access to youth-friendly health services, these were other key areas, and these needs can affect the level of participation and productivity in the workforce. Barriers to young people's authentic participation in community decision-making and civic engagement were also raised as issues, as far as supporting youth involvement in political platforms and taking strategic action. So overall assessment findings indicated that for many young people, their experiences and needs are largely framed by this lack of an enabling environment, which can include poverty, a weak infrastructure, and climate change related challenges. In some contexts, prevalence of violent crime and sexual gender-based violence exacerbate other barriers as well. So I briefly discussed some of the needs that youth have across sectors. Now let's shift to understanding how PYD programs may be helping to achieve cross-sectoral impact and key outcomes for youth. I noted that education opportunities that align with workforce needs, including a focus on soft skills and health-related knowledge and services, were some of the primary areas of need for young people. I wanted to quickly flag a related resource we have posted on our Learning Agenda page. There was a systematic review conducted under Youth Power Action that examined impacts of cross-sectoral programming, specifically programs that integrate workforce development and FPRH components. This resource from a few years ago found 48 projects that integrated workforce development and SRH, and about 1/3 of those included impact evaluations. From this work, we know that a key finding was that most effective programs do more than integrate workforce development and sexual reproductive health. They take a comprehensive PYD approach and include other features such as financial literacy training, links to financial services, nutrition education, and the enabling environment was also addressed by the most effective programs, engaging families, community members, and key stakeholders to shift norms. So what else have we learned since this work? I wanted to share another quick example also from Youth Power Action, a study of the Skills to Succeed program in Bangladesh, which sought to evaluate whether an intervention with integrated workforce development and FPRH components facilitated stronger workforce and health-related outcomes than a single sector workforce development intervention. This intervention was about a year long and consisted of cohorts of youth who participated in intensive employability and soft skills training, some training in a technical field. They had opportunities to work with mentors, and then a random subsample received additional FPRH content, which was integrated into the employability skills curriculum. The study involved an impact evaluation with an experimental design. There was a randomization of youth clubs, and there was also a qualitative process evaluation. However, impact evaluation results were a little bit inconclusive. There were increases in contraceptive knowledge and reported discussions with partners on these topics at midline, but these findings did not necessarily persist at endline. The treatment group did have a higher likelihood of ever having tested for HIV at endline. There were some limitations with missing data and time span. The endline was about 13 months after the baseline. And there was promising evidence from the qualitative data that indicated that youth had gained knowledge in several health-related areas. They were more comfortable discussing and advocating for their own health, and increasingly recognized the importance of family planning and reproductive health for engaging in the workforce. So overall, youth might not always be leaving this program after participating in this intervention with substantially improved, sustained knowledge on these topics, but they are better equipped to identify when they need more knowledge and know where to seek it out. So that was just a very quick example. Overall potential benefits and effectiveness of cross-sectoral PYD programs in achieving positive youth outcomes is an area where we would love to hear more about ongoing or completed research. YP2LE is currently working to add evidence in this topic area through impact evaluations of cross-sectoral programming for young people. However, these efforts are still in their early stages. So we appreciate any recommendations or suggestions for completed research or evaluations examining these topics. And I will turn it back over to my colleague, Chelsea. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharika. And we can, oh yes, okay, this is the correct slide. Thank you so much. So shifting to our theme on the measurement of PYD construct, as in terms of the context of YP2LE related research that has been carried out, there are less resources related to PYD measurement, although this is a constant topic of focus in the cross-sectoral youth assessments that Sharika briefly highlighted. We did also note that there were limited external resources that we identified that were specific to PYD measurement, but noting back to some of the work ongoing under YP2LE, we're excited to share that we're going to be updating our PYD measurement toolkit, and so hopefully continuing to contribute to the literature in this space. As it relates to some of the resources that we did identify in our review related to this theme, sub-themes included notable differences in global approaches to PYD measurement. For example, differences in a Western versus an Eastern approach, and a consistent thread in discussion in our identified resources, noting the need for further localization and contextualization of measurement approaches. More specifically, research and related tools tend to be primarily led by researchers, institutions, and approaches from the West, and designed with a focus on adolescents from the Western world. Additionally, there was a noted need for more interdisciplinary collaboration across the life and social sciences to best understand and measure youth's evolving physical, emotional, mental, and social needs, as well as their assets and skills. Also highlighted among the forthcoming PYD for vulnerable marginalized youth theme, PYD measurement related resources often focus on the importance of considering the complexity of youth experiences, particular adverse experiences, and their impacts on youth outcomes at all stages in the measurement process, as well as the related need for greater collaboration between researchers and practitioners to inform approaches to the measurement process so that any related challenges or experiences are contextualized and considered when applying approaches to measurement activities. While PYD measurement has improved in recent years, advancements have been largely sector-specific, particularly in the health area. Many of the newly developed measurement instruments often focus on mental health outcomes more specifically, although some we identified focused on soft skills development as well. Research includes a measurement from scales and frameworks that are related to PYD, but there was a noticeable lack of resources that related to indicators specific to youth. One peer-reviewed article that we looked at tools for measuring gender equality and women's empowerment indicators in humanitarian settings, but most studies used indicators that were cross-sectional and focused primarily on GBV-related outcomes. Many identified indicators across the resources that we have reviewed also focus more on output-specific indicators rather than outcome-specific indicators. For example, looking at the training received by a youth participant in an intervention, rather than considering the application of those training skills to acquire a position in the workforce. Key documents that did include relevant indicators included UNICEF's Gender Toolkit, which is on integrating gender and programming for every child in South Asia specifically. It provides a comprehensive set of guidance on gender mainstreaming and applying gender equality and social inclusion approaches across all stages of the program cycle, from assessment to monitoring and evaluation activities. Additionally, this is one of the resources that had a significant number of outcome-related indicators. One relevant scale that we identified in our review that I also want to briefly highlight is the Youth Thrive Survey, which measures 5 protective and promotive factors of the Youth 5 framework. Specifically, they look at youth resilience, social connections, knowledge of adolescent development, concrete support in times of need, and cognitive social emotional competence. This is an instrument that has demonstrated high internal consistency and reliability as well. And while it was initially developed in the US, it is being piloted internationally and has been used among youth ages 12 to 26. Another relevant tool includes the Passages Project Social Norms Exploration Tool, which outlines a process for participatory exploration, analysis, and design of social norms interventions. It includes case studies primarily related to youth 18 to 24 in the DRC and Niger, as well as guidance on social norms analysis and tools and vignettes. There's also guidance on contextualizing design, implementation, and monitoring evaluation processes to different contexts and population groups, and is important because social norms are a key part of the enabling environment. Next slide. So shifting to our theme on PYD for vulnerable and marginalized populations, in reviewing resources related to this topic, we identified many frameworks which are targeting vulnerabilities that are more holistic and consider the different characteristics, experiences, and contextual factors related to the youth. This includes considering youth that have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and youth residing in conflict and post-conflict zones. This is also a finding and approach that was noted in a study that was completed under YP2LE by researchers at the University of North Carolina Global Social Development Innovations on PYD impacts in vulnerable and marginalized youth. Having said that, these findings were echoed across other peer-reviewed publications that included in our review, including studies focused on youth living with disabilities and youth experiencing homelessness. Resources consistently noted the importance of addressing vulnerabilities that require incorporating inclusive practices at key entry points of the program cycle. And as part of these efforts, the need to integrate members of youth subpopulations directly in design, implementation, and analysis activities. Similar to the prior theme addressed, existing resources tended to focus on health outcomes among youth in vulnerable and marginalized situations. And the most common population of focus by far was adolescent girls and young women. One study related to adolescent girls and young women focused on an element of the enabling environment, creating a safe space, specifically through the application of PYD in sports settings. The REACH program focused more specifically on adolescent girls and young women to build their agency, empower them, and create an enabling environment via relationships with coaches. The program also provided a cross-sectoral focus by addressing education via literacy-based activities and targeting physical activity and health outcomes. Some of the studies that we reviewed also noted the importance of engaging other key stakeholders, specifically at that interpersonal level. So particularly family members were a key audience, and there was noted findings that showed that there was some success in using more of a family-based approach versus an individual-based approach to improving youth outcomes. However, notable gaps in family members included in these interventions included the inclusion of male family members in particular, who are key stakeholders in influencing social norms in the home and the community. Other research that we reviewed continue to note how target outcomes in one sector can improve other sectoral outcomes, such as providing menstrual hygiene management supplies, sexual and reproductive health and GBV prevention, education, and support, again, to adolescent girls and young women to improve education-related outcomes, and particularly to help support adolescent girls, young women to continue to stay enrolled in school. They also often address social norms at multiple levels, again, looking at the individual and the peer, as well as the community level to support empowerment and foster an enabling environment. Additional promising practices included collaboration between systems such as education and health systems to provide housing for vulnerable populations such as youth experiencing homelessness during COVID-19, particularly to address outcomes such as housing insecurity, health resource and service access, nutrition, and testing. Next slide. So our last theme of youth engagement in PYD programs, as noted earlier, was a theme that we identified less research-oriented resources. Among those that we did identify, studies tended to focus on, again, engaging of adolescent girls and young women specifically, and including them in activities related to social and gender norms and gender equity. Identified studies did focus on youth-led approaches, specifically in research and policymaking, as well as sector-specific strategies. And there's been a particular growth in literature in work related to the democracy, human rights, and governance space. Resources noted a number of channels for meaningful youth engagement in safe spaces, including youth centers, youth clubs, youth councils, mentorship activities, including peer-to-peer mentorship, coaching, and youth-specific decision-making bodies. Many of the resources, however, While focusing on meaningful youth inclusion, again, we're not heavily research focused. So specifically, we observed a clear increase, I would say, in resources related to youth engagement in general, but not all of them are research oriented, and thus many of them were not relevant to include in our review. But do want to note that there is continuing growth of resources in the space related to youth engagement and meaningful youth engagement. Some studies that we did identify, as well as resources, were developed under the Youth Power Learning mechanism, but there was some focus on these resources related to youth outcomes at the individual level, as well as organizational outcomes, which are key for really promoting and supporting that enabling environment to improve youth outcomes. One research guidance note that did really look at this more specifically was developed by Mercy Corps, and it focused on working with girl researchers in particular. There were noted challenges related to need to build young girls' mentors, skills, and confidence to help support the research professional development process, including helping to work with the community to accept adolescent girls as leading research activities and take them seriously as the leaders in these activities. There were promising practices that included collaborating with local female mentors, ensuring specific time for training research mentors and girl researchers, and of course, provision of stipends for mentors and researchers to promote the sustainability of program activities. There was also, related to community acceptance of girl researchers, the importance of instilling trust in the direction of girl researchers to be the experts leading these activities. One note I will share related to youth engagement, but also related to our theme of PYD measurement, was a promising study that focused on measuring meaningful adolescent participation in Cote d'Ivoire and Indonesia, which broke down participation via an adolescent participation questionnaire that considered 7 key constructs, including self-esteem, self-efficacy, social connectedness, belongingness, decision-making, civic attitudes, and civic engagement. Next slide. And now I will hand it over to my colleague, Stephanie Schmidt, who will be leading our question and answer session.
Thank you, Chelsea. So I just invite everyone who is listening. I know that you just heard a lot of information about everything that the Youth Power 2 Learning and Evaluation team has learned over the last couple of weeks of doing this literature scan. So now it's really our turn to hear from you. So I invite you to get your fingers ready so that we can hear from you about which of these findings you think is most significant that you've heard so far, and then also what's missing. So what research do you know of that's happened from the last 5 years that you would have expected to see here? And the way that we want to collect this is to use Mentimeter. For those of you who might not have used that before, there should be a link coming in the chat where you can open up in your browser and respond to these 2 questions, and we'll be able to look at everyone's responses together at the same time. So you can either scan the QR code that's on your screen, or like I said, open up that link that just came in the chat. And while you're thinking about all of this, I think it's helpful to consider some of those gaps that Chelsea and Sharika referenced as they were going through all of the findings. So if you know of anything around cross-sectoral outcomes, that has been a big gap in the research that has been done so far from what the YP2LE team has seen. Anything about outcome indicators related to positive youth development, or measurements and PYD for marginalized and vulnerable populations, even outside of health. So thinking about other sectors, but we still welcome other resources that are specific to the health sector. So I see that some responses are coming in. Thank you. So this is a live show of what others on this call are responding to about what they think are the most significant findings from what they've heard today. And it looks like there's a lot of emphasis certainly on youth engagement, overall, especially around research, around mentorship. There's a lot that's coming in here, which is fantastic. And just as another note, if any questions are coming to mind as you're processing these questions, add those in the chat and we will be coming back to those. And Cole, maybe while these responses are continuing to come in, we can jump to the next slide and see what might be missing. All right, so you should be able to swipe through and see this second question at that same link or the same Mentimeter page that you pulled up on your phone. So what I might do is, as we're continuing to process what are some of these significant findings and what's missing, is just invite folks to come off chat or come off mute and ask any questions or add any questions in the chat. All right, so I see one question that came up in the chat about how families and communities make decisions. So, Lucia, I'd like to invite you to come off mute if you'd like to ask your question.
Sure. So, I mean, I've been working in this space for a while, so this is always something that I feel is missed, and I'm not sure how to bring it up other than, the reason we do study this area is I believe the lens has come from what you're calling the West. I mean, it's the North is traditionally what we're calling it now, but then the global North has more experience in this because I believe young people in this part of the world have less formal roles in society. And the South, you can even find young people in fields, in agriculture. They may have kids on their hips for their mothers, carrying them around and taking care of their younger siblings. But I think it's about recognizing the roles that families and communities give to young people in their own societies. So I'm wondering how that relates to what we're looking for. In other words, there's always going to be a mismatch. Our lens is really North, based on Northern evidence. And I'm just wondering, did you have a chance to look at how families and communities make decisions, the way they're organized, whether they're urban or rural, and look at it from that perspective? I hope that makes sense. Let me know if you want clarification.
Thank you, Usha. I can briefly chime in, but Sharika, please feel free to add. I will note we were very interested in the role of families and communities because as we really think about a positive youth development approach, they are a key part of the enabling environment and help build the assets and agency of youth. So there were a number of studies, particularly related to social norms, sexual and reproductive health. I know also community violence prevention that did look at a family-based approach, noted specifically, I would say, in those sectors. Again, I think a lot of the work that we identified that may be related more to the community also focused on social norms. So really thinking about this, maybe not decision-making isn't the word, but just the different types of norms and just what that process of norm change looks like and how that can shift over time, not just for the individual, but the community and what that looks like. And so I'd say that was the key sort of piece from a very high level that we identified. I wouldn't say at this point we sort of have broken it down where we looked at differences related to rural versus urban. But we did certainly try to, as we thought about the different subpopulations of youth that were prioritized in these studies, look at the geographic focus and consider those factors. But Sharika, I'll let you chime in as well to see if there's anything related to Usha's question you wanted to highlight.
Yeah, maybe I can just quickly add a little bit about the one study that I mentioned, Our Families, Our Future, the resilience-oriented intervention. That was with adolescents in South Africa. A big part of that, I think, was sort of this inclusion of families in working with adolescents as they're experiencing some mild depressive symptoms and thinking about education and access to knowledge about HIV prevention. I think there's definitely room and opportunities for more work in this area. This was just, sort of a preliminary test of this intervention, and families were very satisfied with this program, and they continued throughout the study. They were all retained, but I would definitely love to hear more from other people if they know of other research that kind of takes this into consideration, or looks specifically at the significant role that families and communities can play in decision-making related to adolescents and youth.
And I guess just can I add, I mean, and my point was really to look at the role of youth within that context. So not just them as separate. And I do feel this is somewhat of a gap in our framework. We do look at communities and families, but they are off on a different circle. The youth are actually part of those communities, and they need to live there. They don't live in our conferences, or our panels. They need to participate locally. And I'm also curious, one other is sort of another point, is given the way in which some leaders in the world are very threatened by people who speak up, if we encourage young people to speak up, I'm wondering how much we're considering that in what we do, and if there's any research on that as well. I was kind of curious, and I've seen this on the ground as well, how young people's participation can be seen as threatening, unfortunately. And we project people, unplug and leave at some point, and they have to deal with, whatever the results might be.
I think that's a great point. And one of the things that I will reflect from what I heard from Chelsea and Sharika is that, the evidence looks a bit different when you're looking at different sectors. So I would encourage anyone who might be looking at the way that youth are engaged in different country contexts, especially around the DRG space, to please share that evidence with us, because it has been a bit harder to find in our experience. I also am seeing something that's coming up on this What's Missing page to be a number of responses around livelihoods and economic growth. So just seeing that multiple times, I think it would be wonderful to get to include that evidence. If anyone could share, what were some of your key takeaways from research that you've seen or conducted or used related to positive youth development in that economic growth space. I saw some folks who were working on Feed the Future. I'm seeing a comment about youth empowerment through skills training. Or other recent research that your organizations, again, might have conducted or used that you didn't see reflected in these findings. All right, one tidbit. All right, maybe let's transition. If you could go back to the other question, Cole.
So I see a note, Stephanie, from Julia Noble about USAID projects in Bosnia and Sri Lanka, about encouraging women to be trained and enter non-traditional roles such as welding and construction. Also, a note from Caroline sharing some resources related to advancing women's empowerment. Julia and Caroline, related to our questions, feel free to also mute yourself if there's any research you would like to share related to your ongoing or completed work. And perhaps maybe while I wait to while we wait for others to chime in, I can note, Usha, related to your question of, and I think it's relevant related to civic engagement, about youth engagement and participation. I did want to highlight some work that was done via our youth civic engagement dashboard that we created this past fall, where we did look at sort of youth perceptions, their experiences and their behaviors related to youth civic engagement. And as it relates to youth's comfort, speaking out in that sort of civic space, we did look at whether youth had experience or had fears of experiencing violence related to their civic engagement activities. I will say we didn't see any significance in terms of that related to their engagement or preventing them from engaging in the civic space. But it was something that we did see in terms of youth who were more or less likely to engage. Adolescent girls in particular noted that they didn't feel like they could make a difference. They didn't feel like their communities listened to them, including decision makers. So we did hear, at least from some of our participants, sort of how the value of their engagement or their perceived value from other members of the community impacted their own behavior. So just related to your initial questions. But happy to hear from others on work they'd like to share as well.
Thanks.
All right, so I saw that there was a really good comment from that Chelsea already referenced from Julian, from Caroline. I'd be curious if you both could just share briefly about some of that work, any evidence that's been generated under that. It doesn't need to be detailed. I know I'm putting you on the spot, but just anything that you've perhaps learned over the last couple of years in those spaces.
This is Julie from IESC, and I was talking about some of our projects. So we focus on, IESC focuses on SME development in particular, and the things that go around that. So access to markets, access to finance, workforce development, enabling environment. And I think one of the things that someone else had mentioned was, just about the disconnect, I think sometimes between sort of youth empowerment and youth engagement and then economic growth. And sometimes there's a more separated from the client. So our workforce development programs, we've tried to include, I'm not necessarily sure if we have necessarily like a specific methodology, but it's been, but behavior change is part of that. So encouraging in Sri Lanka, for instance, to, encourage parents and families and communities to allow youth, including women, into the private sector, because it's really, they really prefer government roles, for their children, for security and safety. And then, financial security, and then also physical safety, especially for women. And so that's been a big part of our, the behavior change piece, in addition to the training, the actual training of the skill sets that you need that are being conducted at either the TVET schools or secondary education schools that are going to align with the private sector needs, so that the youth can get jobs. So we've done that both in Bosnia and in Sri Lanka. And I think it's interesting, some of these outcomes of having women in non-traditional roles, so women welders, and encouraging the private sector to see women, young women, as valuable employees. And now actually it's interesting, in Bosnia, some of the private sector prefers women as employees, and it's like, can you train more women to do these things like upholstery and textiles and welding in the metal industry? So I think for me, just connecting these two, the economic growth and then the positive youth development into one project, and utilizing all of our resources together, is something that I think would be helpful.
Thank you so much for sharing about that, Julie. And I completely agree. So much of this work might not be couched explicitly in positive youth development, especially depending on the sector that it works in. And this is where we're really relying on everyone that's here to share any evidence that you know of, even if it might not use the term positive youth development. we really welcome that input to make sure that this update is as comprehensive as it can be and representative of where the field is right now. All right, so I saw that Amy has her hand up. So Amy, if you'd like to come off mute with your question or comment.
Thanks so much, Stephanie, and thanks everyone for the presentation. First of all, can you hear me?
Yes, coming through.
I transitioned from phone to computer. So thanks so much. I have been working on the Youth Power project from its first iteration to YP2LE's new iteration. And in terms of the research, you know, I'd be curious to hear, I heard some familiar findings from Youth Power Action systematic review, literature reviews as well. So I'd really be curious to hear what the main findings are from this additional systematic literature review, or wasn't systematic, you had mentioned that, but anyway, from this phase, like what are the unique findings that came from this that didn't come from that first report? And in line with that, perhaps there just isn't any more research out there. I mean, if we've got 2 projects who focused in on it, you can't find anything else. You're not hearing much from the rest of us on the call. Maybe this is just it. Maybe that's the point to be made at the end of this, is that the research just doesn't exist because it hasn't been conducted. And in order to, you know, analyze better of what works, we need to know, you know, we need more research to, which is usually the end of every report, but we need more research to illustrate that what we're doing programmatically is working. So that's my first question. So what are the main findings that are different from in this review that didn't come out previously? I hope that we don't do another review in the next iteration, because it seems like we maybe have tapped out what is out there and we just need to be getting on the ground and researching more. My second point, or question rather, is what would you all say would be the recommendations from this type of analysis? You know, what can we take forward to our implementers? If the learning agenda question was positive impact, I'd like to know, is it those approaches that do use the social norms approach and gender equitable approaches have a much more positive impact, and therefore that's what I tell people to do. We're working at USAID, like how I advise our missions and our IPs, you know, use this way. Yeah, what are the main recommendations that you would say that come from the research that you've done? Thanks again.
So Amy, I can.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Chelsea.
So I can briefly chime in, Amy, and then maybe hand it over to Sharika, since I know you referenced the positive impacts theme that she also presented on. So I would say, I think an ongoing challenge that we recognize is in terms of available research and learnings is, you know, a lot of times we recognize that there is great work happening all over the world, and sometimes there is just not the capacity to get it out there, you know, externally in our space to share with others. So while we certainly, you know, look at technical reports that have been completed and briefs and dive into the peer-reviewed literature, noting some of the processes and the capacity are needed to carry out those activities. You know, sometimes there are not the opportunities by folks that are doing great work around the world to get their work and to get their learnings out into space for us to learn from. So I think that that's, you know, an important limitation that we continue to think about, which is why we tried to be very broad in looking at, you know, findings, but also again noting findings that had a specific research focus, regardless of where they were published, and looking more in the great literature. So I think that that's, you know, an ongoing challenge that we see. In terms of key learnings, you know, I would say that the best practices that I continually saw across projects that, you know, really seem to, you know, have an impact, really, again, used a number of different frameworks in terms of consistent findings, using a social ecological approach. So again, really not focusing on the individual, but really thinking a little bit more about, again, family and community-based approach, which we've already highlighted, as well as thinking more at the systems level. So thinking about sort of those cross collaboration between different systems, such as health and education, for example, but also thinking about, you know, even accountability at some of those levels, and, you know, whether it be measuring the impact of the work happening in those systems, as well as the effectiveness of that collaboration. So definitely a systems level approach, a social ecological approach was the consistent finding that I saw in, you know, studies that, you know, had demonstrated influence, positive influence on youth outcomes. I'd say there was also, again, a lot of work, as you noted, on norms. So I would say that that seems to be a key piece for focusing on, noting that norm change does take time. So a lot of times we're looking at a study that would have, minimum 2 years, ideally 3 to 5 years, and, noting some of the challenges with carrying out that longitudinal research, is something to be considered. But, just to say that I think studies that, identified in our review that had a social norms focus, did seem to have a lot of promise in terms of improving youth outcomes as well as, of course, engaging youth, and in particular, engaging youth that are the priority population of focus at every step of the project activities. So really thinking about those key entry points in the program cycle, and bringing youth in for the design, for validation, as well as even thinking about communicating some of those findings. So those are just some high-level pieces I would highlight. But Sharika, in our remaining time, feel free to note other pieces. And then I see Nancy also has her hand up.
Sure. I'll just quickly chime in response to Amy's question. Part of the reason we wanted to highlight that systematic review is it was sort of a comprehensive resource related to some of the needs that youth identified, as far as this need for workforce development, training that's relevant, and access to sexual reproductive health and family planning knowledge. The one study we mentioned that is more recent is that the study of the Skills to Succeed program in Bangladesh, which was under Youth Power Action. If there are other resources that are kind of more comprehensive, here's a review of cross-sectoral programs, and here's clear evidence that some of these programs are addressing relevant youth outcomes. That's something we would love to hear from other people. In our initial searching, we haven't found that, but this is an ongoing process. Just to note that as a part of this process, the learning pages will be updated, and we will be showing where more research has been done, and where more is needed, where some of the gaps are, to help guide the field in thinking about where there might be need for more of a focus. And I'll pause there and let Nancy say something.
Yeah, I know we don't have much time. We've lost some folks. I just wanted to say that, yeah, this research takes time. So even though we flagged some of these gaps back in 2018, 2019, when we finished the learning agenda, it takes so much time to build in these research projects. We have like a new generation of youth activities that we're just trying to do that with now, as the Youth Power portfolio ended in kind of 2020. So yeah, this stuff takes time. So I don't think there are any huge differences in what we're seeing through this very rapid scan from back in 2016, but it's useful to kind of take the temperature of where we are. I will say, there seems to be more interventions around these cross-sectoral approaches and building in youth engagement. It's just we're not measuring them in a rigorous way. So I do think that continues to be a gap. And I am always hitting, banging that drum that we need to build in that research. And this, to me, just really reflects that. So anyway, those are my 10 cents. Thanks so much, everybody, for organizing this event.
No, thanks so much. And I know that folks may need to start heading to other meetings, but really quickly, just to wrap up, Cole, if we could pull back up the PowerPoint. Like everyone has heard, the next steps are that this literature scan is continuing. And this is where we're really relying on you to follow up, share any other resources you know of that might help us fill these gaps, connect us to others that we can follow up with, just to, again, make sure that this literature scan does reflect the collective work that's been done in the positive youth development space. From there, there'll be an update to the PYD thematic pages that exist on youthpower.org and incorporation of updates to the PYD Learning Agenda. Next slide, please. And yep, just like Cole just added in the chat, please send along those resources or references, anything that you recommend we take a look at, to Chelsea, who you've heard from today, by March 16th. Next slide. And then lastly, for anyone who might be newer to the Youth Power mechanism, this is just a reminder of all the great resources that exist on youthpower.org. You can find all of the research that is undergirding the previous systematic literature review, resources and toolkits that have been developed in the last couple of years, what works in different sectors, as well as upcoming events. And you can see in the top right that you can register to also get automatic notifications of new events resources as they're added. Next slide. And just to give you a sense of some of the events that are coming up, we have some wonderful communities of practice that operate on positive youth development, with some events coming up around engaging young women in climate change in the Middle East and North Africa, using labor market assessments to both look at marginalized populations and also integrate their perspective by helping them serve as researchers, and looking at community resilience interventions and health outcomes for youth. So there's a lot coming up, and you can find out all that information about upcoming events on the youthpower.org events page. All right, last slide. Thank you, everyone. I know that we're a couple minutes over, but I really appreciate everyone's input and participation, and we look forward to hearing other resources that should be included from you. Thanks so much and have a great rest of the day.